Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation by the American Iris Society. Please support the organization by becoming a member. Go to irises.org and click on Join. Thank you.
I have three fantastic women with me tonight who are going to help present this program. I've got Nancy McDonald, who lives in Michigan, and she is the Roots editor. Roots is the publication that HIPS puts out twice a year. She administrates our Guardian Gardens program, and she initiated the Breeders Collection program. And there's a whole bunch of other things she's done too, but we'll keep moving. And I have Susan Flo with me this evening, and she manages our HIPS shop with merchandise from our website. And she is specifically going to talk about what is involved in an iris rescue, because she managed two very successful iris rescues from the Wanda Razak Iris Farm in Nebraska. And Susan lives in Colorado. And then I have Kathy Eager with me tonight, and she's the immediate past president, and she manages our newsletter and our archives and about a million other things. She is also from Michigan. So with that, I hope that the three of them will chime in at any moment if they feel like I'm going too fast or overlooking something this evening. So first of all, the HIPS mission statement is to protect iris heritage and protect irises from loss. And we have quite a few preservation programs. We try to offer educational information through our website and through Roots, and we have an active outreach program. And I think that most people here kind of understand the idea of an iris becoming lost or an iris losing its name. But if you have no verified specimen of an iris anywhere in a garden, then it's considered to be lost. And, you know, this can happen simply because people quit growing something collectively because they're looking at newer varieties, or it could happen because it was shuffled around from garden to garden and mislabeled or not labeled at all. And those are just things we try to prevent so that we can preserve some of the rare irises that are out there. Kathy, Nancy, Susan, do you have anything you want to add to this slide?
I would just add, this is Kathy, that there's over 75,000, maybe more than that, tall bearded irises alone that have been registered. And if you think about how many of those are, say, yellow self irises with an orange beard, there's hundreds of them. So when an iris loses its name and we can't identify it anymore, it becomes really difficult to get that identity back. We can try, but often, unless there's some sort of really unique characteristic about it, it kind of disappears into history, and we know it was here at one time, but now we can't verify it again. So when it loses its name like that, we try to prevent that so that we always have something out there that we can say, this is a verified iris, and if somebody has a question, they can try to grow it against it and see if it's the same iris.
Thank you, Kathy. So next we're going to talk about our display gardens project, and Kathy's going to take over from here for a bit.
Thanks, Wendy. A HIPS display garden can be a public garden or it can be a private garden. And this is a garden that somebody is growing and is willing to share with the public at least once a year. The requirements for it are to have at least 15 named historic irises that are labeled so people can tell what they are, and to be open at least one day every season for people to view and to chat about your irises. It doesn't have to be a public day. It can be by appointment. It can be just very local. And then the contact information for each garden is posted on the HIPS website. What we do is we put it up there so people that may be passing through your town that are interested in historic irises might contact you and say, I'd like to come see the garden if it's available at that time. So this is a way for somebody that has a garden that's willing to share it to kind of get people excited about historic irises. Wendy, you can go to the next slide now.
It went the wrong way. Sorry, you bumped the wrong one.
That's okay. When somebody signs up to be a display garden, we provide them with a metal sign, and we post the contact information, and we feature the display gardens in Roots once a year. So we have something for them to display to let the people know that come who they're associated with. Right now, I think throughout North America, we have about 50 display gardens throughout the US and Canada. And we're trying to get more every year. We will have people that will join that are private gardeners. We have a number of gardens that are on public grounds that have joined, whether it's a museum grounds or a botanic garden. So all kinds of gardens, and 15 irises is only the minimum. There are gardens that have hundreds of irises. It's really up to the gardener and what they would like to display. Okay. Now, a theme garden is basically a garden that's built around a theme, and the sky is really the limit when it comes to choosing a theme. It could be a hybridizer, which is how we got into starting the breeder collections program that Nancy will talk about in a few minutes. It could be a time period. We have people that will put a iris bed together that will match the age of their house. That's actually pretty common for historic properties. It could be a certain class of irises, all dwarf beardeds. Award winners, that's a popular one. There's a number of gardens around the country that feature the Dykes Medal winners, but there are others as well. It could be a date range. I want irises from the 1930s or the World War II period. A really common one is named irises that fit a theme. I have a couple of examples I can give you. One of them is in my own garden. I put a little bed together for my grandchildren. So I put in irises like Tooth Fairy and Piggy Bank, and there's one in there with a clown name on it. I forget which one. So just a little bit of names. One of our board members at HIPS wanted to put together a theme bed for her sister, who was a children's librarian. So she rounded up all sorts of storybook names, and I happened to have one in my garden called Pippi Longstocking, so I sent it to her to add to the list. So named irises that fit a theme are common. And it's a fun way to do it, because if you have a theme, I was going to do one for my dad. He was a musician with all sorts of composer names, but I didn't quite get it off the ground. But that might come someday. And then a color or pattern. I met a woman a few years back at an iris club, and she had planted an entire bed of black irises. And I said, that's an interesting choice. And she said, well, I just went through a divorce. So it seemed like it fit. And I happened to run into her a couple of years later. I said, so how's the black iris bed coming along? She said, oh, I feel better about it. I planted it with red and white now too. So it's now black, red, and white. And I bet that was pretty stunning. Those colors together would have been pretty awesome. But one of our HIPS members is doing a collection of David Hall's pink irises because she loves pink. So that's how she's chosen to put a theme garden together. So lots and lots of possibilities for theme gardens. And they're fun to assemble. They can be also a breeder collection. They can also be a display garden. They can also be part of the Guardian Gardens program. There's lots and lots of overlap. So we just wanted to present that to you as a possibility if you're thinking about how to build a new garden bed around your own place.
Nancy, I'm going to let you take over here. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Wendy. Yeah, I don't have room for more irises, but I want to help. That's something we hear a lot. But often the people who say that already have a breeder collection. They may not realize it. Many of us find the work of one particular breeder, or in my case, 20 particular breeders, particularly appealing. You really like the work of this person. And without even thinking about it, many of us accumulate irises by that breeder. And in that case, it could behoove you to join the HIPS breeder collection program. Kathy and I kind of dreamed it up on our way to an AIS convention in the Plain one year. We noticed that it helps a collection to have a focus, a point, a goal, and trying to come up with all of the irises by a particular breeder can be exciting and fun and challenging. So it gives a little more purpose to the collection. The example I want to use is Dave Silverberg's introductions. As you all know, Dave recently passed away, bless his heart, after all those decades of working in irises. He only ever introduced about 14, or exactly 14, couple of intermediate beardeds, 10 tall beardeds, and 2 Siberians. And I have his gorgeous tall bearded fire trails, which is what made me crazy about wanting to get the rest of his irises. That was introduced in 1986. So that is indeed historic. I also have his little intermediate bearded Abbey Sunrise, which is a 2009 model. So it's not historic yet. But Wendy, could you do the next slide? So among the very few requirements that we have is that at least one iris by that breeder be historic. It can be 1 out of 100, but if there is one historic iris, it can legitimately be a HIPS breeder collection program. And it's fun. I have no idea if I'll ever find any of Dave's other irises, although he told me once at a convention that he still had them all, so maybe. But the few requirements we came up with are, you have to be a HIPS member. It's a HIPS program. We ask all HIPS members to report their historic holdings to the HIPS data bank once a year. We use that statistical information to help us figure out what's rare, what's still around. In this case, it's a requirement, not a request. So if you want to be a HIPS breeder collection holder officially, you must report your holdings. And you must agree that when your clumps are big enough to divide, you're going to share them with other people. And you can share them with other HIPS members through the reasons on the methods on your screen. You can also share them just any way you want to, just, you know, over the garden fence kind of swapping. But the idea is that you're preserving them and there's no point in hoarding them. The best way to preserve something is to share it. So I think people enjoy having a collection with a purpose, that, but aside from they're pretty, I mean, we all grow irises because we love them. That's kind of a given here. But having a purpose and a point makes a collection more interesting in a way. Okay. So frequent questions. People want to know, do I have to collect all of their irises? Well, my goodness, no. If you want to collect Shriner irises, you're going to need acres. So you can focus it down to a decade or your favorites or a color. The most rare ones is sometimes a neat way to look at it. Then people ask about, what about those themes that Kathy was just talking about? For instance, I am nuts, for my sins, I guess, about diploid variegata irises. I just love them. All the little ones that start with Sanssouci and all of the, you know, Kupferhammer, all the strange little yellow on top, some variation of purple on the bottom, but the diploids in particular. I think we may eventually expand the breeder collection program and call it something like HIPS theme collections or HIPS focused collections. We're still working on this, but it's a neat idea and there's no reason why we couldn't do it. And then people want to know if they have to go public with it. No, they certainly don't. We respect people's privacy, but when I was running the breeder collection program before I talked some other poor soul into doing it, only one person out of, I think, almost 100 wanted privacy. She wanted to be known on the website by her cat's name. But the point of being listed on the website is if you're looking for, say, a particular iris by that breeder, you can get the word out more easily. So it's nice to come out of the closet with your name and say, yes, I collect SAS irises or whatever. Another question we frequently get is about quantity again, is what if the person only introduced 3 irises? Great, it's a collection. I collect the irises of Robert O. Kleinfelter. I saw his granddaughter is with us this evening. There's only 3 of them, and she introduced one of them on his behalf. But that's a legitimate collection. There are collections of 1. There are people who introduced 1 iris, quite a few of them actually, and that's fine. So we're not snooty or particular about how many are in your collection. We just want you to enjoy those irises and share them with others ultimately. And as Kathy said about the theme gardens, irises in the breeder collection program can also be part of display gardens, guardian gardens, national collections, and so on. So it's not exclusive. And I believe that's a lovely segue to the guardian gardens section on the next slide.
I don't have a question in the chat, but I would ask if anybody does have any questions at this point to type them into the chat. I do have one question myself. What would you call a collection, or where would it fall? I'll describe it a little bit. The Lincoln Iris Society has a public garden on the campus of the University of Nebraska. And what we're trying to do with that garden is to include just Nebraska hybridized irises.
Cool.
So would you call that a theme garden or a group of hybridizers? Because it's
yes. I think that very, very neatly fits into what maybe the next level stuff with what we're now calling the breeder collections program, and may change to the focused collections program, because that's exactly what it is. It's a focus on a geographic area. It's a great idea. I'm really glad you're doing that.
Yeah, it's not a big garden, but there's well over I think over 100 irises now, and we had some that were not Nebraska hybridizers, and we're slowly replacing those with only Nebraska hybridized irises, just for a theme for the garden, and it is on the University of Nebraska campus. So
nice. All right, shall I forge ahead?
Yes.
Okay. The most important thing you can do for historic iris preservation is grow the irises, clearly. The second most important thing you can do is join HIPS and educate yourself and have fun joining in the various features and projects and things we do. Once you have a few years of iris gardening of whatever your chosen class is, once you have that under your belt, and you feel confident that you can grow your chosen class of irises pretty well in your climate and conditions, you may want to take it to the next level. The Guardian Gardens program is designed for experienced growers. This is not for raw beginners, but for people who want to take preservation just one step further. It was invented or dreamed up in 2014 by Doug Pascal, who has since moved on to other exciting projects. And he asked me then to administer the program, which I do. We have more than 235 members at this point, with somebody joining about once a week. So it's very exciting, very interesting. What we do is we collect the rarest of the rare historics. And in some cases, I have a few irises in my collection that, as far as I know, it's the last clump anywhere, but no pressure. And there are a lot of them where they grow in maybe 2 or 3 gardens. And that is a little disturbing. So what you do when you're in that situation is you coddle that iris and you propagate it as quickly as you can and share it as quickly as you can, so that those precious eggs are in many baskets, not just one. And that's a very satisfying feeling. It's the opposite of hoarding. We're getting those eggs into many baskets with the ultimate goal of eventually, of course, it would be fun to get them back into commerce, but at least we can safeguard them. And the reason we want to do this is, well, multiple. Many of us just prefer historics, and that's what we work with. But also, you probably all heard of the heirloom vegetable movement, and the reason for trying to preserve those older varieties for the gene pool and For sometimes vegetable breeders will go back to basics and they'll breed something modern with something very old because of some exciting attribute that maybe was overlooked in the past. If we lose all our iris historics, we're losing a huge gene pool. And the Guardian Garden program is designed to collect, propagate, and distribute the most endangered irises. Right now, we're focusing on bearded irises primarily because they're the easiest. It's really easy to ship bearded irises around, you may have noticed. I would love to expand into other classes. I think we will need more people on the administration end if we do that. But it's an exciting program. I encourage everybody who feels confident about their ability to grow irises to consider joining. You can grow one Guardian Garden iris, or you can grow 1,800 of them. But the idea is sound, that we do this anti-hoarding and get those historics back out there.
Okay, at this point, we do have a few questions for probably 2 or 3 of you to answer. There is a, let me find it here again. Question from Debbie Strauss: do the breeders' collection have to be historic? Some of the newer hybridizers don't have old ones. And then I think Dell answered an earlier slide, said there must be at least one historic in a collection. Is there anything you want to add
Correct.
to that?
No, it's the reason we require there be at least one historic is because it's the HIPS Breeder Collection Program, and that's the Historic Iris Preservation Society. So we would love to see AIS do something like this. And we tried to make the parameters as broad as we could by saying if there's even just one that's 30 years old or older, all the rest can be modern and you can still be part of the program. But we still have to give a nod to the H in HIPS.
Yes. Then there's a question and a comment, I think, from Dottie Labman that you mentioned. Says, you're probably going to address this, but how do I sign up for, I'm assuming for the breeder collection? I too have my grandfather's 3 irises, so at least there are 2 of us.
Yeah, our current chairperson is Alice Laughlin, who was not able to be with us tonight, but her contact information is available on the HIPS website. Hi,
Okay.
Dottie.
Then there's a question: is anything being done with using DNA or genetic makeup to ID unknown iris? Is it even possible? Cost prohibitive?
I can answer that one because I looked into it this spring. I have an iris bred by Agnes Whiting that I think is called Cadet Blue, but it's a full sibling to Blue Rhythm, which is famous and a lot of people have it. So I contacted a number of genetic testing companies, most of them were in California, and asked about this and what they could do. And they said, right now, nothing's being done. The most they could do would be to try to run the genetic sequence and pull out some specific markers to compare, but it would be rather expensive. And their focus right now is on vegetables and cannabis. So it's coming. I think within the next 10 years, there are going to be some big strides. And it would be great if you could look at an iris, if you know what the parent irises are. It seems like it could be done where the genes could be compared to see how much of them actually match up. But we're not there yet, but it's something I expect will be coming down the line.
Okay. Then there's a question from Gayla. Says, I'm interested in collecting Moore and Mitchell introductions, but don't know where to find them. Any suggestions? And there was a comment from Jean Richter that Bluebird Haven Iris Garden carries a number of Moore Mitchell introductions. Any other comments?
Indeed, they do. And we have a list of current vendors on the HIPS website as well. And we encourage everybody to patronize them.
Okay. Then Del Perry says, she says, I am collecting Lynn Flanagan's Arrowbreds. if you have any, please contact her at cndellirises@yahoo.com. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Does anyone grow the arrowbred anacrysis? And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct either. Dell, if you want to chime in on that.
It's anacrusis.
Anacrusis, okay.
Yeah, and it's Shondell Iris Gardens.
Shondell.
Yes.
And
Kathy, anacrusis could go in your music garden.
Yeah, if only arrowbreds liked far northern Michigan where Kathy and I live. Sadly, they do not.
And Chuck Chapman's chimed in on, I think, on the DNA and genetic issue about identifying irises. This actually is easier than the information you were given. You can use digestion and use snippets.
Okay.
And I think that's, well, then I had another question that came in a different place. How often are we seeing historic irises that are mislabeled, especially in public gardens and that sort of thing?
Often.
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer that. It happens on a regular basis. One problem we have is that people find what we call noids. They have no ID in old farmyards and, you know, cemeteries and all over the place, and they slap a name on them after looking at 16 photos. And iris identification and identity confirmation is much, much, much more complex than people realize. So we wind up with misidentified irises fairly often. And as you know, with all the tens of thousands that have been introduced over the decades, there's a lot that look quite a bit alike. So one of the focuses in the Guardian Gardens program in particular is identity confirmation, because there's really not much point in putting a lot of effort into preserving a certain iris with a certain name if you have the wrong iris. There's intrinsic reasons if it's beautiful to preserve it, but that's a different kind of preservation. So yeah, it's common to see misnamed ones.
And then the last comment I have at the moment is from Dell again, says, I'm also looking for arrowbred pied beauty. Thought I'd found it at the Bryce Thompson Arboretum in Arizona, but it was not. So that could be in one of those misidentified, mislabeled or whatever irises. But anyway, she's looking for pied beauty.
There was just a lovely chat comment from somebody whose name I didn't catch about provenance on historic irises. That is one of the things we also push in more and more in HIPS, and particularly in Guardian Gardens, not just your immediate source, but where they got it and where they got it and so on. Now, from a commercial source, you can't write to them, you know, Shriners and say, hey, where'd you get that iris you're selling? You know, they don't have time to deal with that. But in our swaps, in our sales, all of those things, I'm pushing hard for people to provide that information and record it so that we've got some kind of paper trail, as it were, of where these irises came from. So whoever wrote that little chat, thank you.
Okay. And then Dottie Labman had an example of Miss Arabella and Abelard being confused or mislabeled. And that's being corrected in a public garden here in Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
And then is there any way to identify an iris? The first iris I planted is wonderful, but I kept no identifying info and the label disappeared in the weather.
We do have, on the HIPS Facebook page, we do have a group of people who will attempt identity. it's really difficult. Unless it's an extremely distinctive iris, it can be complicated and hard. You have to have somebody who has the right pictorial memory and many years of experience looking at irises. It's real easy to look at an iris and a good description and original photo and say, okay, that's not the right iris. It's much, much harder to look at an iris and come up with suggestions for what it really is. So we encourage people, for the most part, to enjoy unnamed irises for their beauty and preserve them because you love them.
The
Yes.
only true way to even attempt to identify it is to grow your noid next to a known iris. And sometimes you get lucky. I was given a really pretty placata noid 5 or 6 years ago from a woman who lives downstate. And I grew it, but it was just, you know, Aunt Hilda's noid. And it was blooming 2 springs ago, and I was admiring it. And I turned around in my garden and I was looking at the same iris. And I said, wait a minute, I almost got dizzy for a moment. And after cutting them and comparing them, and the bloom was the same, and everything about it was identical. That was a sheer stroke of luck. It turned out to be confetti, which is a very popular Shriner iris. So it was reasonable that it was a pretty good identification since it had been spread all over the country. But people like to visit our iris gallery online, and they'll find a picture that looks close and decide, okay, that's it. But the only way you can identify it is to grow it next to a known quantity. So we try to help people with that. We try to set them up with somebody that might have a known piece that they can send them to compare with. But we really discourage people trying to identify irises based on photos because there's so many ways it can go wrong.
And I think you just answered Heather's question. Is there a recommended procedure for confirming your noid? Is it published online?
There is information on the HIPS website, and our new website launches next week. So if you look at it tonight, it'll be in a different spot next week on the website, but it's there. So yes, we have a whole section on identification and aids to identification.
And,
one of the things I recommend to people who are anxious to learn about identification, which is fascinating. It is absolutely fascinating. Phil Ettinger wrote an article many years ago. It was published in Roots long, long ago when Roots was still black and white, called "I'm Sorry I Didn't Get Your Name." And in that article, which is published on the HIPS website, it's in the library, he gives a long list of things you need to look at. And it is a long list of identifying characteristics, some of which can vary with climate and soil, and some of which are invariant. And once you start studying that, and Phil is by far the best tall bearded identifier I know for historics, you start looking at that and realize what Phil was talking about in that article. Suddenly you get in a whole lot less hurry to run out and slap a name on something.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, even in the same day, something that blooms, you know, in the early morning, it can look very different than what it looks like in late afternoon after being out in the sun all day. So let's see, there's let's see. Someone says, Robin says, very interested in assistance IDing iris. I have a number that came from my mother's garden, who got them from her mother, etc. I'd love to have the names. So there's a lot of interest in that sort of thing. Someone was looking for Eleanor Roosevelt, and there's been already 2 or 3 people mentioning where she can find Eleanor Roosevelt. And that's a fairly pretty popular one. I think quite a lot of people have it, actually. I think that's all for right now.
Okay, let's go on to a project that HIPS is running. It's not really a preservation project, it's an identification project. I first wanted to just encourage the woman that asked about collecting irises from a hybridizer that might not be historic yet. I'd strongly recommend, if you love the irises, start to collect them now, because they will be historic eventually. And it's shocking how many irises that were introduced in the 80s and even 90s are gone now. We just can't find them. The breeders don't keep them. And if gardeners don't keep them in their gardens, then we lose those too. So I'd say, yes, collect them now if you love them. Eventually they'll be historic, and you're doing something good to save irises that might disappear otherwise. We have a project at HIPS called the PCT project, Purple Coloration Types. It used to be called PBF, for purple basal foliage, but we're building a database of irises that have some type of purple coloration, and members are submitting their observations and we're adding them to a data bank. We're looking for purple coloration on the fans, the stems, the space around the buds, a wire edge on the leaf, and even the rhizome itself, because all of these can be identifying. The classic example is the iris Wabash, and I believe it's a Bright Hour, Nancy, the other one that looks just like it, except one has PBF and one does not. It's the only way to tell them apart. So this is going to be a really helpful identification aid for us in the future. And you can go to the next slide, Wendy, and we'll show some pictures. Purple coloration types. People think of PBF as just the purple at the bottom of the leaf fans, but there can be purple all over irises in places that most of them don't have it. Here's some examples. Our project manager, Shab, is colorblind, and so he looks for these kinds of things and says, this is what it should look like if I could see the purple, but I'm unsure. If you peel back the base of a fan, you often will see something like this on the rhizome itself. You'll see stripes of purple coloration. That's a characteristic that could be used for identification. You can also see purple on stems. You can see purple on the space of the buds and the bud valves. The one that I thought was fascinating is that one on the right, purple leaf margin. I haven't seen this in any irises that I have, but boy, that would be a really cool identification piece to have if there were irises that we knew had that, and there are some. So we ask people to kind of canvass their gardens in the spring when things are starting to come into bloom. That's when the purple coloration is the strongest. And to let us know which irises they're seeing it on and where they're seeing it. And we're gradually building a data bank of information that we can use for identification and research. So
Kathy, are we gathering that information on modern irises as well as historic?
I believe Shab said that he would take any information, because they're all going to be historic eventually. So if people can look at them now when we have definite examples, it would be helpful. And we've asked people to not only tell us which is purple, but tell us what doesn't have purple coloration. Basically, if you have a list of your irises, just check off the purple ones and send it to us, and then we'll be able to add it to the database. But this is, we just started this a year or two ago, and we're building up. So eventually we're going to have a good database that people will be able to use for research and ID work.
Okay, good evening. I'm Susan. I live northeast of Denver in Colorado, and I'm going to share with you my experience with organizing the Rescue for Wanda Rezak's Gardens, and that happened in 2016 and 2017. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about the spreadsheets and what we did first and what we did second. And I'm not going to do that because we'll run out of time. It's a lot of work. But if you have specific questions, if you want copies of the databases I built, please reach out to me. More than happy to share it with you. In 2016, I became the lead for this rescue for Wanda's Gardens. Her garden was located in Sidney, Nebraska, which is about 3.5 hours northeast of me. And I was the closest person who had the availability to do something at the spur of the moment, because it seemed to happen quite quickly. And if you look at the slide, this is one of the pictures of Wanda's Gardens. She had begun her journey in the 1950s, and she had accumulated over 3,500 different cultivars. There were hundreds of her irises that were fading very quickly from the commercial sellers. They were no longer, you couldn't find them. But over 350 of them were considered critically endangered. And these were the ones that we wanted to target and rescue. Wanda told me that when she got into her mid-80s, she started worrying about who was going to take care of her irises, because it was becoming very clear to her that she wasn't going to be able to do it much longer. And her sincerest wish in contacting HIPS was to have these beloved irises relocated to loving homes. I had never been involved in anything like this before, and I was a very green HIPS member. I knew this was a big project. I knew it could be very far-reaching. I was very hopeful it would go well, but I did have my reservations whether I could manage it. We can go to the next slide, Wendy. But I soon realized that our success depended on these three things. We had to locate those rare cultivars in her massive gardens. We had to reach out and attract a dedicated group of iris lovers to come and help us dig them out of the ground. And we also had to identify a willing group of adopters who would take these at-risk cultivars and nurture them and grow them so we could share them among ourselves. And in this picture, on this slide, we have Ray and Cindy Gallegos. They came from Arkansas. Sin is the one who runs Cindy's Iris Garden. And in the back there is Leslie Rule. She came from Hallam, Nebraska. So despite my really apprehensions when we first started out, we were very successful. And let me very quickly characterize for you this overall experience. So Wendy, we can go to the next slide. And let's look at the team that assembled. On the right here, you see Gary White with Wanda. On the left, starting way on the left, we have Tom and Tammy Scahan, who run Ozark Iris Gardens. They came from Arkansas to help us. In the center, we have Wanda, and she's flanked by Wendy and by Leslie. The next person is Vicki Cobb. Vicki was a professional chef who worked 6 days a week, and she asked for an extra day off to come and help us, and she was from Scott Bluff, Nebraska. And then the last person here is Nina Morris, who came from Wellsfleet. So here we are, we're at the gate, ready to go, and we all have this sense of urgency. Time is running out for these irises. Most of us were very new to this experience of rescuing cultivars, but rescues had happened before, and the more experienced members of HIPS knew how to make this happen. They had a document named the Rescue Primer, which was very helpful. So working with that tool and working with these people who had previous rescue experience, I realized that the mission statement of this organization to preserve the at-risk irises was not just some mumbo jumbo. I mean, HIPS wore cleats. They knew how to walk the talk. And we can go on to the next slide, Wendy. And this is how it happened. We had this tremendous sense of urgency. We all wanted to make a contribution. And then, just like gentle spring rain falls from blue skies, as soon as HIPS put out the information that this rescue was going to go forward, we had volunteers stepping forward to participate. The people who manned the shovels mostly came from this part of the country, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Arkansas, but the people who wanted to lovingly take these cultivars popped up from all over the United States. And that was a very good feeling. In this slide is Fred and his sister Fran. They drove from Parker, Colorado, and spent the day with us, helping us dig out these rhizomes. But as we came from all parts of the country, or parts of the Western country, we suddenly felt embraced by a real overwhelming spirit of collaboration, of warmth, eagerness, sincere support, and an interconnection developed very quickly. Wanda was shocked. She came to me and she made the comment, "You guys don't even know each other. It's just amazing because you're all getting along." Well, of course we were getting along. We had the same commitment. We all shared the same heart of love for irises that could soon be homeless or go extinct. And we had a willingness to do our very best to keep them blooming. So it all worked out. Wendy, you can go to the next slide. And let's not forget to say, we had all this work to do. We were dirty, it was hot, but you know what? We had a lot of fun. And here we are at the post office with our 30 boxes of packed rhizomes the day before the 4th of July. And I have to tell you, when I got back to my home on Monday and Tuesday, I was getting emails from adopters telling me that they had received their boxes. That's how quickly and how fast this worked. It worked well. And as we pulled out of Wanda's driveway, both of those years, we knew that as Wanda waved goodbye, she had a deep sense of gratitude. And you know what? We had a very good feeling about what we had done to accomplish this. So in conclusion, if you like growing historic irises, or if you have fun or want to have fun with happy people, and that piques your interest, reach out to us, because we always have something going on. It seems every year we have some type of preservation project going. It may not be an out and out rescue, but people are saving irises. And if this piques your interest, please look us up and join us. If you have any questions about Wanda's rescue, please feel free to ask them. Thank you.
There is a comment from Deborah Scott, says, "I stopped and helped dig with my 2 kids as we were moving between Colorado and Minnesota." And I have to say that I was involved in that rescue. It was a wonderful experience, and it all happened in one day, it seemed. But I have to give Susan a lot of credit for, she had been there weeks before, days before, looking up where those irises were and flagging them with Wanda, and then all of us came together and dug them, cleaned them, packaged them, and shipped them out all in one day. It was an amazing experience.
And a wave to Deborah. Thank you so much. I remember you. You were on the move and you had everything in that trailer and you were headed east.
Yeah, I remember Deborah too. And it was very nice.
Susan, this is Andy. How do they contact you if they're interested in helping?
Why don't I can put my personal email into the chat and they can copy it.
Yes.
But if you're not a member of HIPS, you might want to join up for $16 a year. They got a great magazine and we're fun people.
And Robin Allen is asking, did you save all 350 of the endangered ones? And I hope the rest are being looked after over the next few years.
Well, this is what happened. I'll answer your second question first. Tammy and Tom Scahan actually bought that iris farm. And over the last 5 or 6 years, they've been going back and harvesting all of them and taking them to Arkansas. So they'll get whatever we didn't get. The first year we targeted, I think 127, and we got 70% of it. We got like 89. But the second year we went back, we targeted 330 cultivars and we got 282. So about an 80% success rate, which I think is really good. We're in the process now of growing them out and identifying them because Wanda's gardens were so overgrown. You thought you got this cultivar, but right next to it was something different. And you got that instead. So I'm really happy that Tom and Tammy are getting all those rhizomes because the ones we missed, we have a good chance of recouping them and finding them again.
I will add one comment. I think that people don't realize how big this garden is. I think it's something like 5 acres. You can correct me on that, Susan. And there are literally irises everywhere. That whole ground is covered with irises. And I've known Wanda for about 20 years and had been to her place several times. And when it was in bloom and a couple times when it wasn't. And it was just absolutely spectacular. But to do a rescue of that magnitude when with that many irises is overwhelming. It was just incredible. And but with Susan really did a great job of organizing the whole thing. And that's what a rescue is all about. It was a really nice way to help Wanda. And she was quite active in the whole thing in helping identify where irises were and the whole thing. But I will say she started collecting irises the year I was born, 1952, and she was adding to that collection every single year, all the way up until just a year or two before we did the rescue. She was well into her mid-80s. She's still buying new things. And so it was just incredible, the numbers and the scale of her collection. So I think it's really wonderful to have HIPS do that and to help Wanda. There's a couple of other comments. Del Perry says, how does HIPS put out the message that they need help for a rescue?
Well, a lot of it went out through email, blast emails to all the members. That's what I remember. And it came from Doug Pascal. Mm-hmm. And I would give him like, people contact me this way or people contact me that way. And then I managed everything through email and phone calls.
Okay. And then there's a comment from Pug Paris says, you've inspired me to add one more statement to my will. I have named the order of selection of my Dykes Metal collection, family, friends, and university. I am going to add an amendment to put HIPS on that list. Hope they aren't distributed soon. And I think you're going to be talking a little bit posterity planning here in a second.
Great segue.
There is one, I think, going back a little bit to the PCT. There's a couple of questions or comments about that. Let me find it here. What about purple shading or color that runs vertically in the leaves of the fans? And I think you talked a little bit about that with the edging, but I'm not sure if they're talking about variegated fans or not.
I would say if there's purple coloration, we'd like to know about it. We probably don't have listed yet all of the purple coloration that can occur in an iris. But if you see it, and even better, can take some photos and send it to us, we'd love to know about it.
Okay, and then Holly Johnson's asking, is the PCT on a particular cultivar verified before the information is posted?
Well, right now we don't have it posted. We have it in a database that we're building. And we do get conflicting reports sometimes too. I know of one iris where we had 3 or 4 people say, yes, there was purple basal foliage on it, and another that said, no, I'm not seeing it. So somebody there might have a mixed up ID. So we're tracking all of the reports that we get for every iris type, every named iris, and adding it to the database. So we may have 12 people that report that Wabash has PBF, and then one person that says it doesn't in their garden anyway. But it'll help us to establish some guidelines for each iris of what we're seeing and not seeing.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the questions I have now.
Kathy, one of the things you'll find with some irises is that certain characteristics will appear one year and the same iris the next year won't have them. And purple base foliage occurs that way on certain irises. The worst example, or the most egregious example, is that beard color can change from one year to the next on just a few irises, but it does happen. And then it can change back again the next year. So sometimes it takes more than 1 year to really be sure that something does or does not have a certain character.
And that's a good point, Bob. And we can encourage our members to send in their reports every year, because then we can track it from year to year and see what's changing.
In addition, we encourage people, for instance, the classic PBF, the purple basal foliage, we ask that people look at the irises when the iris is in bloom, because there are a lot of irises that have PBF early in the season and it disappears toward fall. But if everybody looks at the iris when the iris is in bloom, no matter what climate you're in, no matter when your iris is bloom, that's an identifier. A blooming iris is a blooming iris in any climate. So if you're interested in joining this study, I would say look on the HIPS website to get the criteria like that.
And Chuck Chapman mentions that purple marking, especially PBF, varies with weather and sunlight. It's more pronounced early in the spring and with colder temperatures, I'm thinking he's saying. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. So this is, I mean, everything played into a really nice transition into posterity planning then. What Susan was able to put together to help rescue Wanda's irises was a really good example of Wanda having some foresight and making plans for her garden. So of course, the first thing we would say is, if you're collecting irises, please communicate with your family and let them know what your wishes are. Maybe you have a family friend, a family member who might be interested in being your heir for the irises informally, or whatever the case may be. Your irises could become a donation to HIPS later. We have some resources on the HIPS website about posterity planning, but I was going to take some time to show you a sample letter of intent that you might draft. Rather than having it be an item on your will, you could include a letter of intent. That way, Nancy explained this really well, but you wouldn't want your family to be trying to sell your home and have a couple of irises in the garden hold up the sale of a home. So it's best to put it into a letter of intent rather than attach it to your will. That way, as Nancy said, if it's January and people need to sell the home, they don't have to worry about the irises at that time. But I'll kind of run through the key points of our letter of intent. And I know you can't read this because the print is really fine, but it is available on our website. First of all, make sure that you express to people, these are my wishes. This is my desire. This is not part of my will, but I want you to make the best effort with my garden. And pardon me. you can explain to people, your family, your loved ones, that there's a value out there because some of these are historic items. They're rare. I want to ensure their survival, because your family may just really think that you just like collecting irises, and they don't realize that there's some greater value in some of those items than just that it's your hobby. It would also be a wise idea to make sure that your letter outlines how your family can find your records or your garden maps or whatever the case may be. Are they saved on your computer in a spreadsheet? Do you have a book of maps that you've drawn? So make sure that that information is in your letter so that they can find them. If you're holding multiple collections at different properties, make sure to outline that so that your family understands where those would be. I do know when we were at Wanda's rescue, I got to peek at Wanda's book where she kind of had like a coding system for the maps of how her gardens were laid out. And it was kind of amazing. And if you do wish for your irises to be preserved beyond your ability to care for them, then having something laid out like that would be really valuable, especially if your clumps are crowded the way that Wanda's were, or if you don't have really clear and distinct garden markers for them. And of course, garden markers can always accidentally get moved. So, and I think that in the letter of intent, Nancy has had a hand in this, so she can speak to this more, but definitely mention that HIPS would be interested in these irises, and that HIPS would be willing to help if there's concerns about how to distribute these irises to people who can care for them. It might be helpful to list somebody that you've enjoyed gardening with who understands what's happening in your garden, because they could help the family to distribute the irises or interpret your iris records. And if that is just overwhelming for the family, maybe add a paragraph just encouraging them to reach out to HIPS, because HIPS can come in and do a rescue like the one that Susan outlined. So that way the family doesn't have to feel overwhelmed by what could be a really tricky thing for them to do if they haven't gardened alongside you. Nancy, can you think of anything that I may have left out here? I guess I had one more slide, that it doesn't hurt to visit with future property owners, and you can always ask if they would be willing to allow a grace period for HIPS to come in and get a few of the items after an estate has been settled or something like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nancy.
When we put this letter of intent together, I actually consulted my husband's and my legacy lawyer who did our wills and trust, to ask him, how do we do this? Because it was important to recognize that HIPS is a national organization, in fact, an international organization. And what he told us was that wills and trusts and all of those things vary a lot from state to state, and in other countries you can run into all kinds of problems putting this stuff in your will. But all jurisdictions, he felt, would recognize a letter of intent as simply your wishes. So if you write a letter of intent, you make it pretty formal, as this sample is, and of course you can tweak it all you want to, and go over it with the people who are going to inherit from you. That's the main thing, is they need to understand this matters to you in a big way. This matters enough for you to write this legal document, which you then give them a copy, you keep a copy, put a copy in your safe deposit box. You can even send a copy to HIPS if you want to. If you know it, I'm kind of sticking my neck out there, but you could. It's the important thing is that everybody involved in your life understands that, as Wendy said, this is more than just a hobby. This is something that matters to you. On the other hand, a letter of intent is not going to bind them. They're not going to, if they're in financial hardship and they need to sell that ground right now, it's not going to put your family in a situation where they're thrown out homeless because you're stupid irises, you know. So a letter of intent is a very good compromise. It gets your wishes across. It protects the irises, but it doesn't put your family in a bind.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. So at our website, we do have some links for more information on posterity planning, so you can visit that sometime. We have an article that was published in Roots. The sample letter that I took you through very, very quickly is there. There's a document on living trust. So please feel free to visit that and utilize that, because even if your irises that you are collecting right now are not historic, they're going to be. So it might be really beneficial for everybody if you did this. And I believe that takes me back to Kathy, who manages our outreach.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. I wanted to just remind everyone that we've been busy for the last 6 months building a new website for HIPS, and it's wonderful, and we hope that everyone will love it. It launches next week, and Posterity Planning has its own section that you can reach from the menus right on the homepage, and all of those documents are there for you to download and to view. Okay. Wanted to share with everybody some of the things we do, not just to take in irises, but HIPS also reaches out. And this is a fun part of being in HIPS, because we work with gardens and around the world to preserve and to showcase. And it's not just private gardens, public gardens, museums, historic properties, national landmark properties. Sometimes it's the HIPS members that get the ball rolling by alerting us to a garden's existence that we don't even know about. So I pulled out 3 examples that I thought you might enjoy to see how this sort of snowballs. And Wendy, if you can go to the next slide. Our first example is in Prescott, Arizona. The Prescott Area Iris Society manages a wonderful garden of irises at the Marcuson Sculpture Garden at Yavapai Community College. And they have a Dykes Medal collection there. They have a collection they started of Agnes Whiting irises that I got them started on. And they are now doing a collection of Arizona hybridizers. So the earlier comment about hybridizers in Nebraska kind of made me think of this, Gary, because it's a great idea. But because they've been working on this for a number of years, they have another project that they thought they wanted to start. So go to the next slide. And they also manage some of the gardens at the Charlotte Hall Museum in downtown Prescott. And this is a group of historic buildings. It's not just one museum. But they came to me and said, you have an idea for somebody's irises we could put there that would kind of fit the age of the museum and the time period when Charlotte Hall lived. And it turned out that Charlotte Hall and Grace Sturdivant had a number of things in common. They lived during the same time period. They were both single women. They were both doing things that were not particularly approved of for women at the time. Charlotte Hall was Arizona's first territorial historian and the first woman to hold a salaried position in the Arizona government. And she lived at the same time that Grace Sturdivant did. And for those of you that know a little bit about Miss Grace, she never married. She devoted herself to her irises and introduced a number of famous irises that were used in breeding collections all over the world, and many of them are still available today. So they started a Sturdivant collection at the Charlotte Hall Museum. And then go to the next slide, Wendy. Something rather sad, they wanted to put together a memorial garden for the hotshot firefighters from Granite Mountain who died in that terrible fire out there in 2013. So Dennis, the then president of the Prescott Area Society, wrote and said, we want to do a theme garden and do it around names that pertain to firefighting. So we found irises such as Valor and Fire Chief and Valiant, and sent them out there to establish the garden. So this is a way that HIPS is able to give back and to reach out and maybe get people interested in historic irises in a different kind of way. Wendy, go to the next slide. Here's another example. This is Dolores Abram. I call her our preservation powerhouse. Dolores moved from Texas to Rockford, Illinois, and began working for the Midway Village Museum, which is a pioneer museum with many buildings on it. But she wanted to start an iris garden there of pre-1930 irises. So she reached out to HIPS and we said, yes, we can gather some up for you. And we turned around to our members and said, what have you got? Before we knew it, we had 50 or 60 different irises to send her. So she was able to start a lovely iris bed there, and they've since expanded it. They put it in their Victorian garden. They put it out by the road. They do a lot of weddings there, so they've got irises growing all over the wedding area. Go to the next slide, Wendy. And the year after we did this, Dolores wrote again, and she said, well, I've been in touch with the Tinker Swiss cottage. A man named Robert Tinker built this cottage that he made look like a Swiss architecture cottage. And she said, I really love to do an iris garden there. They want to revamp their gardens and their grounds, but the house and the gardens are haunted. And I said, oh, I need to hear about this. So it turns out that Jessie Hurd Tinker, who lived there, was a huge gardener. There's a picture of her down there with her big iris garden. But there was a children's home across the road, home for orphan children. And according to Dolores, the neighbors won't go on the property because they've heard children's voices. They think they've seen Jessie wandering through the gardens, but it didn't matter to Hips. We wanted to get the irises she needed. So we sent irises there for them to reestablish the Tinker Swiss Cottage gardens, and they're doing beautifully. I guess they've had a lot of paranormal people coming in with sound equipment and all sorts of cameras trying to see things, and they claim that things are going on there. Robert Tinker, who built the house, was struck by a train and he survived, but the last 10 years of his life, he was confined to the bottom floor of the house. And people will say they see him and they hear him in the house and they see Jessie in the garden. So anyway, the iris garden's doing great. Go to the next slide, Wendy. Well, the Midway Village Museum during the COVID last year did a silent auction fundraiser, and Dolores put a basket of irises in, and they were won by the executive director of Indian Hill Manor and Farm, which is a historic property that's open to the public in Rockford. And they were about ready to start revamping their gardens, and they had a big iris bed that needed to be redone. So they wrote to Hips and said, how can we do something with historic irises? And we put the word out and we're able to gather up irises and send them there. So this is fairly typical. In the last few years, we've seen these kind of projects snowball from one thing to another, but it helps to spread the word about irises, and it's a good way for Hips to put irises out there in the public where they might not otherwise be seen. Okay, Wendy, go to the next slide. And it's not just in North America. We're also helping to build some collections in Europe. We've got breeder collections that are part of the National Collections Program in England. We've got people that are collecting irises for breeder collections, hoping to put them in a National Collections Program. Sir Michael Foster's great-granddaughter wrote last spring and said, I really would like to get as many irises of his that I could. And we started canvassing around North America and ended up finding about 15 or 20 that we sent over there this year. And we've helped to populate a new national collection in England of Ferdinand Cayuse irises. That'll be an ongoing project over the next few years. But because irises that are long lost in Europe might still be available here and vice versa. One of the irises that Sir Michael's granddaughter was looking for was Blue Boy. She said, I can't find it here. Well, it grows in a lot of gardens in North America, so it wasn't really hard to find and be able to send her a bunch of it. And a few years ago, they sent us Lemon Ice, which is a Mary Tharp iris that hasn't been seen here in an awful long time. But now it's here and in the Guardian Gardens program, and eventually it'll be distributed. If it hasn't already, it might already have been out there. So we're researching and exchanging irises to try to fill these gaps. And it's a pretty fun thing to do, to look around and think that you're plugging a hole in an iris collection across the Atlantic. Go to the next slide, Wendy. This year's project, we partnered up with Mariengarten in Basel, Switzerland. Mariengarten has a beautiful collection, one of the biggest in Europe, of historic irises, over 1,500 of them. And Nancy and I met the directors of the garden at the Presby Iris Convention back in 2016, I think. And we've kept in touch, and they wrote this year and said, we're going to dig up and replant and move the entire garden. It's going along with a big project that we're doing, a construction project. And we'd like to take this opportunity to try to share some irises with you and to see if you have some irises that we don't have that you could send us. Well, because of the time constraints of the construction and when they had to move, and the inspection and permitting that we needed to have to get the irises into the United States. We weren't able to bring any in this year, but we were able to send irises out. And Lisa and Barbara sent us a list of about 70 or 80 irises that they wanted. Many of them are long gone, at least they haven't been seen in many years. But we found 30 of them and we're able to send them over to Basel. And this is what they looked like when they arrived. They're soaking in water because they've been in the transit for 3 weeks. But they sent us some pictures a couple of weeks ago of the replanting of the gardens. And it's nice to know that HIPS was able to contribute and help to fill some gaps in their collection. And eventually, when we can get all of the inspections and permitting worked out, we'll be able to bring some irises back from Europe, from their collection that we haven't seen here in a long time. And they'll go straight into the Guardian Gardens program to be grown and shared. So eventually they'll be repopulated here. Does anybody have any questions about that? I think that's the end of my slides. Okay.
Well, we appreciate AIS for facilitating this tonight and allowing us to kind of showcase the different things that HIPS is trying to do. I hope that some of you in the audience find some parts of this inspiring and would consider joining HIPS. And as Kathy mentioned, we'll have a new website that will launch next week. So we hope you'll come check us out.